and assessed, and additional requirements for NOx and other pollutants be added as appropriate. Vehicle emissions, use of alternative fuels, that's primarily fleets and heavy trucks. Congress decided not to attack the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards, and that, at least now, is being addressed in the National Energy Strategy, as it was mentioned. Air toxics, hazardous air emissions. This involves not only utilities, but other industries as well. And it's a real sleeper. Congress has mandated that EPA do a 3-year study to look at these 191 substances and identify the 30 that are the most hazardous. They have to do that within 3 years. Within 5 years, they have to come up with a plan for reducing significantly those emissions levels in some cost-effective manner. That's going to be a real challenge for EPA and for the industry, hopefully working in concert to do that. The fourth item you see there is the acid rain, reduction of SO2 and NOx from utility sources. We're going to talk a lot more in detail about that. That's going to be my primary discussion, so I'll leave it for now. The R&D aspect is really a continuation of the NAPAP study. It's hopeful that whatever comes out of additional work in this NAPAP study will be more useful than the previous work and the impact it had on the original 90 legislation. Protection and visibility in and near national parks is pretty much self-explanatory. That, to date at least, is centered around Navajo and its impact on the Grand Canyon, an area of much controversy. There's additional study required in other regions of the country now, and we can expect to see that problem highlighted in many other areas of the country. Already there's been some requirement or some question of an additional unit in West Virginia and its potential impact in the Shenandoah National Forest area. We've got 5 other provisions to round out the 11 operating permits. They're all the requirements that utilities and all potential polluters are going to have to fulfill. They will include all Clean Air Act requirements, not just the 1990 provisions, and it will have to include compliance schedules as well as all monitoring requirements. This is going to be a vast paperwork problem for most people. Stratospheric ozone and global climate change, primarily phase-outs of the CFCs and HCFCs that we've heard about. Enforcement, EPA has been given a broad range of new enforcement capability, and you'll be seeing everything from what amounts to a traffic ticket to criminal felonies now associated with violating provisions of the Act. The disadvantaged business section is really a mandate that at least 10% of the R&D funding go to disadvantaged businesses, and the employment transition assistance is retraining for miners in the high sulfur coal industry. Next, the Title IV, as I indicated, was really provisions affecting NOx and SO2. Talk a little bit about NOx first and try to keep us on schedule here very quickly. Basically, the NOx provision is traditional command and control. EPA is trying to reach a 2 million ton per year reduction in NOx emissions. They haven't imposed any type of a national cap in that area. The compliance date that you can see for Phase 1 affected units is 1995, and we'll talk a little bit more about what Phase 1 affected units are in the SO2 provisions. Low NOx burners are currently thought to be the most cost-effective technologies available, and they are the technology that's being mandated. You can see what the limits are. The wet cyclone and other boiler types aren't included in this category because it's not known what technologies will work in those areas. That's still a matter of development. If, in fact, comparable technologies to the low NOx burners can't be met, EPA will defer regulations in those for those boiler types until the year 2000. So there's a 3-month leeway there. In anticipation or recognizing the other uncertainties, EPA is also allowing for an extension of up to 15 months if utilities can't acquire, even after making good faith efforts, the low NOx burner technologies and get them installed by 95. SO2 emissions. The overall goal of this program was a 50% reduction in SO2 emissions from the 1980 baseline. Beginning in the year 2000, there will be a 8.9 million ton per year cap on SO2 emissions. Basically, that means emissions from any new units will have to be offset by reductions in emissions from existing units. Okay, looking at the major provisions, this goal of the 50% reduction will be achieved in 2 steps or phases, as it's been termed. The first phase will begin in 1995. The affected units there are about 110 units, or 110 plants actually. That's between 60 and 70 units, depending on how you count them. All other units will have to be in compliance by the year 2000, and there are approximately 2,400 other units that will be impacted in phase 2. Essentially all other utility units in phase 2. Now, how is that actually going to be accomplished? EPA or Congress has moved away from command and control techniques in this area and are trying a rather innovative new approach that they hope will result in a least cost compliance strategy. Allowances will be provided to owners and operators of affected units. Those 111 units in phase 1 and the remaining of the other units in phase 2 beginning in the year 2000. In order to comply, allowance holders can buy and sell these allowances on a nationwide basis. Hopefully, as I said, this will result in a least cost compliance, and Congress anticipates saving about 20% over what it would have cost had a command and control technique been used. Basically, those utilities that can reduce their emissions most cheaply will do so and probably over-comply, freeing up some allowances, which then can be sold to those utilities who find emission reduction more expensive, so that those utilities, rather than go through a costly and in some cases impractical attempt to comply with the 2.5 pounds per million BTU or the 1.2 pounds per million BTU, will be able to buy allowances cheaper than they could have complied and continue to operate in their normal fashion. Let's take a look at what an SO2 allowance is. It grants the holder the ability to emit 1 ton of SO2 each year. Each allowance, it says, is good in any year. That means it's good in any year that it's issued or forward. You can't use allowances before the year in which they're issued. Each unit will get a share of allowances based on a predetermined formula. Basically, in phase 1, units will be granted allowances based on a formula that essentially says they get 2.5 pounds or 2.5 allowances per million BTUs times the heat input based on an 85 to 87 time frame. In phase 1, that 2.5 is changed to a 1.2 factor, and existing units will be granted allowances on that basis. There are no restrictions on how allowances can be used. They can be bought, sold, traded, banked, leased. They can be pooled. Most allowances will be used, however, by those acquiring the allowances initially. The other significant factor here is that ownership of allowances isn't limited to utilities or to owners of facilities. Speculators can get into the market. Coal companies are already looking at the market. There's even been some discussion of environmental groups buying up some allowances and just retiring them, and thereby further reducing emissions beyond the 8.9 million ton cap. Now, there are two other ways people can acquire allowances. It's uncertain. This is, as I said, a new concept. It's been this allowance trading concept has been used in limited cases before in some areas of the country. It's never been tried on a national level. It's uncertain how this whole market will develop. In order to prime the pump, if you will, EPA will begin auctioning allowances, as indicated here, and these auctions will be held annually beginning in 1993. Hopefully, these initial auctions will provide some valuable market information, particularly with respect to the initial values that allowances will have. Congress also hedged its bet a bit, not being totally sure that this allowance system was going to work. The market was going to be a free and open one initially. Decided to require direct sale of at least some of the allowances. It's a fallback position, position of last resort, if you will, for people that don't have enough allowances or people that weren't granted enough allowances by virtue of having existing units, independent power producers, non-utility generators, or other people wishing to get into the business. It is essentially a last resort. Current thinking is that allowances will be valued in the $300 to $600 range, so $1,500 will definitely be a last resort position if the market doesn't materialize. Look at some of the compliance strategies. Utilities today are having to decide how they're going to comply with the Clean Air Act. The regulations aren't written yet. This allowance trading market's not established, but utilities today are having to commit capital and other resources to meet these 95 deadlines. This is an outline of the general ways that utilities will comply. Scrubbing is thought to will be used on a minimal basis by some utilities to produce additional allowances. It's felt most utilities will be coal cleaning or switching or some combination thereof to reach compliance. Now, what is all this going to cost the country? Well, as you can see here, we're expecting $4 to $5 billion per year in cost for the SO2 and NOx provisions. And you can see in the other areas, the visibility is uncertain, and air toxics at $5 billion could turn out to be a rather conservative figure, depending on how those studies go. What the remediation measures are dictated based on those studies could be well above that $5 billion figure. Okay, now what's this going to mean to your ratepayers back home? Well, on average, not too bad, about a 2.5% increase. And I can say that up here, not too bad, because I don't have to face any rate commissions or anything. But people that do are going to find even 2.5% a little hard to take. However, it's not evenly distributed, and some utilities are going to be paying considerably more than others. Interesting here about 10 of the utilities are going to find themselves in a position to have to increase rates over 20%, and another 20 utilities are going to have to subject their customers to a 10% rate increase to cover the cost of compliance, even with the allowance trading program. Look at this on a geographic breakdown. If you look at the map and add the numbers in the column there, you'll see about 85% of the costs are going to be borne by 15 states. Most of those states are in a fairly narrow area east of the Mississippi. Brings us into what are the, in addition to the technical considerations and issues that are raised, what are the rate and regulatory implications? Theoretically, this open market approach, up to now at least, we've talked about this open market, free market approach in theoretical terms. In reality, it's going to be an open market, but it's going to be overlaid in a regulated environment. That greatly increases the complexity of the process, and decision making is going to be extremely difficult, not only for utilities, but also for various economic regulators that will get involved in the process. In addition to EPA, as you can see, you're going to have your state public utility commissioners, you're going to have FERC, and FERC heavily involved in implementation of the Clean Air Act. And this is some of the great regulatory issues we're looking at are prudence, cost recovery, looking at the number of options we had on a previous slide there for utilities. It's difficult to imagine with that number of options, permutations and combinations that utilities have available to them, that in hindsight they're going to have chosen the absolute least cost plan, and that's going to open them to potential after-the-fact prudence reviews and disallocation for imprudence in some of the decisions that they're being required to make now in this uncertain market. Markets versus regulations. Here we're talking about individual state interests. Public utility commissions have a mandate to look after the best interests of their constituents. Unfortunately, their constituents are within state boundaries. Utilities seldom operate within those same state boundaries, and you get into conflicting individual state requirements. New York State now is looking at whether they should allow utilities in New York to sell allowances to utilities west of them, fearing that those allowances will be used to increase emissions, and considering the prevailing westerlies, New York State will be the beneficiary of the pollution as well as the money that would be gotten from those allowances, and they're looking at that trade-off. Pennsylvania is looking at requiring their utilities to complete all trades internal to their state first before they can even consider trading with anyone outside their state. Florida, a high-growth state, is considering requiring utilities in that state to hold allowances for possible future use, considering they are a high-growth state, and there's in phase 2, this 8.9 million ton per year cap. Do they really want to let utilities sell off those and then be faced with future shortfalls in the following year 2000? So you can see we've got some other issues at play on a state basis. State versus federal tensions. There's a possibility of pooling these allowances as well. How will they be handled? Will individual states be able to adequately regulate those? Or will FERC be required to regulate the allowance pools similar to what they do in bulk power sales? Information disclosure for a free and open market. The maximum of information would be desirable. In a competitive environment, there's certain confidentiality you'd like. How is that balance going to be struck? Is government going to collect this information and distribute it, make it available, or is it going to be done by a private enterprise? Conservation and renewables, we're looking at here primarily externalities, or what's been termed societal costs, and how will those be factored into the regulations and requirements? Taxes and accounting issues. I had I don't know what the best term is. I had to address a couple of weeks ago the Financial Accounting and Standards Board on clean air up in Connecticut. These are the people responsible for setting accounting practices. They're concerned with how these emission allowances are going to show up on the balance sheet of utilities. And I'm about to wrap up. Also, the IRS, if you go through the numbers and say $400 for an allowance times the 8.9 million allowances per year, you're looking at a $3.5 billion amount that's potentially taxable. Is the IRS going to turn their head and say that's not worth looking at? That's hardly likely. Quickly, forums for addressing these issues. We've got EPA. They came out with an absolutely tremendous idea in this Acid Rain Advisory Committee where they got the utility industry, their own people, they got utility commissioners, environmental groups, consumer advocates all together to identify the issues and try to reach common solutions. Well, in the short time that they had to get together, which was from January until July of this year, they really didn't reach consensus on many issues, but at least they identified the issues and gave EPA their individual positions on the issues, and hopefully the draft regulations or the regulations that come out in September will reflect some reasonable balance between the various views. State public utility commissions, there's currently a dialogue with utility CEOs and various neighborhood commissioners on some of these non-environmental, non-EPA related issues. The Keystone Center is a similar activity to the ARAC process, the EPA process, the same people, but looking at other economic issues. FERC recently held a public conference, and quickly the EEI has a working group looking at developing industry consensus and economic regulations, and UARC, the Utility Regulatory Group, a similar effort in the environmental regulations EPA is putting out. In sum, I'd like to say I think this is an interesting new approach. I think it's going to require an interesting new concept and agreement between the EPA, the environmental regulatory community, between the economic regulatory community, utilities, and environmentalists if we're going to put this complex law into a set of reasonable regulations. And I'm hopeful we can do that. Thank you.
That concludes our panel presentations. We're in the bottom of the ninth. The score is tied. The bases are loaded. We're now around to the question and answer portion of the agenda. And the way I'd like to approach this, if the panel is agreeable, is I will read some of the questions and then indicate if specific panel members have been designated or otherwise throw it open to the panel. The first question came to me, and it was, I observed that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is not represented among the panel members, and why the omission? And the answer to that is that the committee that prepared this session did invite EPA to participate, but EPA declined. The second question, how does fresh water, or lack of it, affect the energy policy of California? And Commissioner Vilas, we would address this to you. If this is a factor, how is California addressing it?
Well, it depends on the fresh water you're talking about.
I think it's on this up here.
How's that? Okay. It depends whose fresh water you're talking about. There's plenty of fresh water in the Northwest. There's not very much fresh water in California. Now, I don't know whether you're talking about hydropower or whether you're talking about using turbines or just what are we talking about? I hate to find out who the questioner was, but if you're talking about hydropower, there's plenty of fresh water in the Northwest. We import a good bit of our power from the Northwest on exchanges. We don't rely on them to operate our system, to be sure, but we purchase cheap energy there. Our hydro system in California, in Northern California, is hurting a bit.
Thank you. The next question has to do with the direction of electric power policy development under the National Energy Strategy. It's noted here that the development of electric power policy under the National Energy Strategy is being headed by an attorney. And the first question, this is a three-part question. The first question is, why isn't an engineer in this job? I guess it's difficult to speak for Department of Energy. We can comment. I would invite any comments from the panel about either how that selection occurred or what we think would be a better process.
Just a philosophical observation. Can't answer the question, but being an engineer, I look around in the halls of Congress for either at the member level or at the staff level for engineers, scientists, and similar professions, and there are hardly any. You can count them on your hand. So I think that might be leading to the answer to the question, and then therein might be the answer. Not to say that I think I have an idea who the person we're talking about. The person is extremely competent and articulate, but certainly not an engineer or a scientist.
The next part of this question has to do with what is the IEEE doing to get engineers into top policy positions. And again, I would open this up to the panel. I know that Dave Sharma's experience is probably relevant here. Dave, you already indicated your role with the energy issues in Senator Ford's office. I think one thing that we have discussed privately is the possibility that there would be an increased number of IEEE congressional fellows to have a greater influence on the policy process. Any other ideas from the panel? Charlie, this might relate to the Energy Committee to some extent.
I believe there's a member of Congress who's either an engineer or in IEEE. Is that right?
Yeah, it's Congressman Don Ritter of Pennsylvania, and he's very active in science and technology issues, and but he just won out of 435, and I believe there's another one who has a PhD, but he's there's only one engineer, maybe two to my knowledge.
I think we need to improve our communications process with both the administration and the legislative body, and then of course we could all start showing some interest in politics and perhaps getting elected.
How about
Can I comment on that? And I'd like to just throw something out for you to chew on. A number of people have said over the years that I've been on the commission, how is policy developed? Why don't you have people with this expertise? The same question that's raised here. I think you would be wasting your time, quite frankly, trying to get engineers in positions of, quote, power, until and unless you understand how the system operates and how decisions are made at the top. The fact that a person is an engineer in an important position is not at all relevant unless that person understands how decisions are made and understands the system. An engineer for the sake of an engineer is ridiculous. It goes back to the question of attorneys. Attorneys have just gotten into these positions because it's one of the things that, generally speaking, their undergraduate degrees cause them to get into. And they go on to be attorneys because they have some other agenda in mind. Engineers don't behave that way. And I think it would be really strange to have engineers change their kind of behavior. I think it'd be much better advised to getting, if you're really concerned about this, to getting associated with folks who understand how decisions are made at the top.
For example, what you say is correct, that it takes more than being an engineer to be good in the congressional process, in the decision-making process. That's very true. But I think if there is an appropriate mix in the halls of Congress, in members of various disciplines, and not just emphasis just on one profession, I think the decisions might be slightly different. The absorption process of trying to know what a superconducting supercollider is, what some of the electric power technologies are, I think decisions might be slightly different. I think that process needs to work. So I do agree that maybe some engineers, scientists, and other maybe should be getting involved in the political process.
Okay, the next question has to do with air quality inside the home, and the question is new codes for housing. How will they affect air quality inside the home?
Currently in California, they will not. This is something that will be looked at in some detail for the next set of both residential and non-residential standards, which would be coming down the road in about 95, I think. It's an issue that was discussed during the latest round of standards revisions. It's something that was put off.
Next question is, will the environmentalists succeed in having power dams, this is hydro-related, raised and increasing fish production? If so, will this significantly affect hydropower production?
We are devoting significant resources in our 1992 electricity report to looking at this very issue because of the fish issue in the Northwest. We don't know the answer.
I think that's primarily a Northwest problem right now, although there is one dam in Maine that they're trying to raise to reintroduce Atlantic salmon there. I don't look on it as a nationwide likelihood at this point. I think in some places in the Midwest, getting involved with salmon as an endangered species, I think it's likely that there may be some facilities lost there. I think it's unlikely that it's going to be widespread around the country. I don't hold out hope for really any new significant hydro production facilities. I think we're going to be lucky to hold on to what we have. Now, while we're not, I don't think we're going to have any dams raised or lost, or a significant number at least. I do think we're going to have the capacity and energy from existing facilities reduced as we go through this relicensing process with the number of units that are coming up for relicensing between now and the year 2000. I think we're going to see a significant portion of the hydro generation diminished as a result of minimum flow requirements and other environmental impact studies that have the potential for significantly reducing the amount of generation from facilities, although the dam isn't going to be removed itself.
This one has to do with social costs and social costing techniques. Directed to Dr. Vilas, you stated that the Commission has not developed externality costs for carbon. Would you explain the considerations that led to that situation?
Yeah, we're going to revisit this in ER 92. In ER 90, we were so far over the map, I mean, there were just numbers all over the place, that we simply, in our electricity report 90, put in a placeholder of $26 a ton of carbon. And it was strictly a placeholder. It had literally no effect on any decisions that would be made down the road. But it's a difficult issue because the data really are limited. There's a general feeling, though, with regard to the evaluation of all emissions, that the air boards in the local districts are likely to be over-controlling, i.e. setting extremely high values for emissions which really don't exist. That is, assuming that society has a higher value on health than in fact society actually has. So we are revisiting that issue as well. The data are pretty much available, we think, for NOx and SOx. The carbon data are not quite as good.
Next question may have been planted by Charlie Clare, I'm not sure. At any rate, you may have an answer for it. The question is, are copies of the IEEE Energy Policy Committee position papers available, and if so, how?
Well, first of all, I did not plant that question. Secondly, yes, and you can get them from the Washington office, particularly Chris Brantley would be the person to contact, and he would send out all or a particular position paper.
Thought you'd like that. This one is directed to Commissioner Vilas regarding the accusation that California has exported its pollution to other states. For example, the Four Corners Generation Complex. What fraction of its electrical energy does California now import?
Oh, I'm going to have to take a guess. I really don't know. Somewhere between 15 and 25% of our energy comes from out of state. That'd be the Southwest and the Northwest. Maybe a little higher than that, but it's most of it is economy energy. Most of the Northwest is on exchanges. Be that as it may, even if we imported an insignificant portion of our energy, we've debated this issue internally at the Commission, and we made the decision that whatever energy we import, we will place a value for emissions on that energy, so that in our planning we will be bringing in what we think is the least cost resource.
Next question has to do with again, the process and the expertise of people involved in the process. I'll read the question. Reviews of the testimony at public hearings on energy policy show the vast majority of those who testify do not have any real knowledge or expertise in key technical questions or on the overall system economic questions. Can the majority of testimony evaluation procedures be used to establish policy under such conditions? And that's in quotes, majority of testimony. How can engineers be more involved? So this relates to the earlier question about the involvement of engineers in the process.
I'll offer an answer to that as well, or a comment. I think it depends upon the forum in which one is talking. If you get involved in the resource plan for the state of California, it is a totally open process. Anyone can testify, and all of the information is on the public record, and anyone who does testify receives all of the information that goes on the public record. And to say that data are not available or used, we've got literally 30 or 40 people in our assessments division, forecasting division, that do nothing but crunch numbers and are extremely dismayed when a commissioner would dare suggest that a policy recommendation not be 150% consistent with the numbers that he or she crunched. Now, it may be different in other forums in other states or at the federal level, but in the state of California, I can assure you that that is not the case, and that people are encouraged to come forward.
What I have seen in Washington of the hearing and markup process in a forum like this, as I said in my talk, I think the question had to do with the background of the people who are testifying, who are presenting the hearing, the testimony. Is that correct? Well, I haven't made a survey of that, but I do. I have read quite a lot of the testimony. The testimony, when it's the person who is giving the testimony may not have the appropriate, direct background. That is true. But I think it's a result of a lot of input that he gets from the experts. So I think the testimony by itself, the written that comes, does have some expertise behind it. Just like to point out, however, that the way bills are made up, the amendments, the markups and all that, there's a lot of input into it, and not all of it is technical, not all of it is logic. There are 20 members on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and they have their own interests, the states they're representing. The member from Colorado wants natural gas. The member from Kentucky wants coal. So it's the logic by itself is not the end, not the whole input. It depends upon, how many votes you have.
I'd like to piggyback on that just a little bit. There's an expression that goes around in Washington about political processes, and it says that emotion always wins over fact, and perception always wins over science. And I think that there's some truth to that. I think that in a political process or in a social process, perception is a dominant factor. Now, I think we as engineers could probably take full advantage of understanding that principle, and we could work at altering people's perceptions as opposed to just presenting facts. And that's something that probably could be the subject of a much longer discussion, but it's an interesting subject. Charlie?
I just wanted to make a point that in the recent testimony that I gave, happened to stick around for a few minutes and listen to somebody from Greenpeace talk about DOE's nuclear weapons programs, and then some people from a hospital in Detroit were also testifying on the appropriations process. And one of the things that sort of struck me about that was I doubted that there was an extensive approval process that they had to go through in order to make their testimony. In the case of IEEE, someone has to sit down and write or compile the testimony. Generally speaking, in the terms of the Energy Policy Committee, we have an ad hoc group that has to approve the testimony, and then it's passed up through the hierarchy until it's approved. I can remember on one occasion sitting in a hotel room as late as 9 o'clock the night before I was supposed to testify, waiting for some people to approve it. So we were faced with the possibility of being in Washington, I'm not from Washington, having testimony prepared and not having IEEE prepared to support the testimony. So I think the process of getting together engineers, and I suspect it's not too much different for the other large technical societies, there are some impediments that the societies build up themselves. And I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it's just an observation. It's just not easy for IEEE, for instance, to testify.
That's, again, to piggyback on that, I think in the public policy process, sometimes it's more important to be fast than to be accurate.
Could I just, want to add one other thing? Mr. Violet said before, you have to understand the system. And in the political system, the considerations, in addition to the factual ones we like to think are paramount, there are other political considerations that generally weigh more heavily on the final decision. Knowing how that process works, I think, is invaluable. Too often, I think, you go through these hearing processes because they do try to get all affected parties involved and are an open forum for anyone who wants to get up and speak, do provide information on all sides of an issue, and allowing a politician or decision maker to pick and choose the particular facts that he wants to support a decision made based on some other considerations. But I think it's incumbent on us to not get carried away with trying to change the perception. In spite of the fact, I think you can change the perception in concert with the fact. We heard that IEEE has a rather extensive review process before you can testify. I think that's good. Too often you do get some wild statements made at hearings. What you find out is you can make a wild statement at a hearing if a congressman uses that information in justifying his decision and later on gets shot down. That's the last statement you will make in a public hearing. So you really have to maintain your credibility. And I think while it is cumbersome, I think the IEEE process review cycle is a necessary one for long-term affecting the process. By the same token, I think I'd rather see engineers, rather than get into the political arena themselves, participate more at the grassroots level and try to educate the masses, for want of a better word. Really, politicians are more likely to be swayed by public opinion rather than a fellow politician, for instance.
Thank you. The next question is directed to Dr. Pape. It says, by the end of the next 20 to 25 years, what percentage of electric utility power will be generated by nuclear power? Considering that a number of existing units will be near the end of their 40-year life period, and the ability of utilities to extend their licenses through demonstrated life extension programs.
In point of fact, the first units, the oldest units, are coming up and about to, or in the process of entering into their life extension licensing with the NRC. And there are going to be significant issues which will have to be addressed during this relicensing. Point number one is the fact that regulations have evolved and they may have been grandfathered to some extent. So there's going to be a capital burden placed upon the older units if they go through the relicensing process. This will mean they will have to go through the justification analysis that relicensing and expending whatever capital needs to be spent is done, and that the extended life will pay for that. That leads you to a very interesting problem. What if you get to within 4 or 5 years of end of life and you don't have the extension to your license? Do you continue to put in capital improvements to an existing plant if in fact the amortization period is going to shrink, because the economic justification then for doing whatever it is you were going to do is shortened, and it may not make economic sense. So the life extension has to occur at a fairly early point. You can't wait with a 40-year license to year 35 or 36. You have to bite the bullet and make that decision earlier so that you can begin to do those things which require capital well in advance of that time period. I think some of the older plants, the very old plants, may in fact not make the economic hurdle in terms of life extension, and that's pretty much a gut reaction on my part. But I think you will find the vast majority of nuclear plants will go through life extension and will be successful in life extension. Right now, nuclear is in the high teens in terms of percent of energy, electric power energy in the United States. And if you begin to remove that from the mix in the post-2000 time period, you need to find alternatives to that, and it might be difficult to do that.
Next question says, the auto is perhaps the second most expensive item in a person's finances. Has any serious consideration been given to mass transit strategies, if not as a total solution, at least a way to put a dent in an old problem? Strategies for moving from the Potomac, Chicago, and south of San Francisco. And this was directed to Dr. Violet, but anyone else would like to comment, be fine.
I must have answers to everything, I don't know. In our 1989 fuels report, one of the reports which we are mandated to send to the legislature, we looked at the transportation issue. We looked at it in 87 as well as 89. But in 89, we reached what I think is a very simple conclusion that a lot of people had recognized, but I think it was the first time it was ever brought to the attention of the legislature. Look, if you're going to look at the transportation sector, if you're concerned about pollution problems and energy security problems, you've got to look at transportation as an entire system, as opposed to looking at it in bits and pieces. That creates a bureaucratic nightmare Because the bureaucratic nightmare at the state of California level is that in order to look at transportation as a system-wide or on a system-wide approach, you've got to have the Energy Commission there looking at energy security. You've got to have California Resources Board looking at it in terms of air quality. You've got to have California Department of Transportation looking at it because they're concerned about vehicle miles traveled and pushing more people over given miles. And you've got to have all the local agencies looking at it. How we can ever bring about a coordinated systems approach, I don't know. It's an absolute nightmare. But that recommendation is there. It is a recommendation that, by the way, will be forwarded on again to the governor. And what the outcome of that will be, I don't know. It would seem to me that you've got to have some kind of a coordinated effort among the various agencies to make any inroads whatsoever.
Other comments?
Well, I just got a note from the chairman that I could plug a session that we're going to have this afternoon, the Energy Policy Committee on Electric Vehicles. There'll be 4 speakers. One to Clark Ellings to talk about the research view of electric vehicles. Bob Ragg from General Motors, who will speak from the vantage point, of course, of the automotive manufacturer. Gentleman from PG&E, Roland Risser, to talk about the utility view of it, and then I'm going to talk about the end user side of the electric vehicle industry. So, I'd like to see you all there, but I know there are other things that you might be interested in.
Next question. Studies show that, this has to do with acid rain. Studies show that 2% of Northeast lakes are acidic. Please compare the cost of putting lime in these lakes with the cost of salvaging the world from global warming.
No comparison. I don't have the actual numbers, but it's orders of magnitude difference between liming an acidified lake, which may or may not be acidified due to power plant emissions, and controlling on a national basis or world basis.
It was noted that, this is directed to Dr. Bilas, it was noted that when you mentioned combined cycle and new gas turbine technology as ways of meeting future California energy needs, how about cogeneration, especially the use of waste heat for chilled water for air conditioning and to improve overall utilization efficiency?
I don't know the percentage, but we have a significant amount of cogeneration in California today, and I believe that the amount of cogeneration will continue to increase over the next decade. That a lot of this, the 1,250 megawatts that I talked about, where I said combined cycles, there'll be cogeneration in there, I'm sure. A lot of the cogeneration in the state of California, however, depends upon the market price of that black stuff called petroleum, because a good bit of our cogeneration is in Kern County, where there's heavy crude oil production, and so that depends upon the world market price of oil.
This has to do with global climate change or global warming issue. 2 leading California utilities have recently committed to a 20% reduction in their CO2 emissions by the year 2010. The question is, are these goals reasonable? And what will be necessary to accomplish these goals? What would impede the attainment of these goals?
My quick and dirty answer is that I don't think the utilities would have come forward and said they will do this unless they knew darn well they could accomplish this.
I think, from my understanding, it would really be necessary to have someone from those 2 utilities comment to give a complete answer. But my understanding is that this involves looking at the total energy requirements, not just the utility energy requirements, and that the reduction is achieved basically through energy efficiency, increased use of electro-technology, and that sort of thing, substitution of electricity for other energy forms. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think the important point here, I alluded to it a little bit in my talk, this business of the synergy on using electric technologies from an air quality point of view. There's If you look at it from a fuel source point of view and the mix of generation that utilities have, this may not be true if you talk about an Ohio Valley predominantly coal-based utility, but looking at those which have nuclear, using natural gas, have hydro, have some renewable and alternative technologies in their mix, from a fuel source point of view, you can actually reduce carbon emissions by switching over from fossil-based systems to electric technologies. And there's a good fraction of what they were talking about is based on that. And also the complete swing and elimination of oil from the combustion mix of fossil fuels and going more and more towards natural gas, because the carbon-hydrogen ratio is obviously considerably better. It's 4-to-1 versus 2-to-1, so you get a 50% reduction for every barrel of oil you can convert to oil equivalent on natural gas.
This has to do with the state of California and their calculation again of externalities costs. Does California compute an environmental externalities cost for coal-fired generation? If so, how is it calculated? Is it used in the decision process for utilities in buying, selling, and building electric energy supply?
A lot of questions. We only import, for all practical purposes, we import our electricity generated by coal-fired power. We have taken the emissions values that we calculated for the South Coast Air Basin, and for imported coal-fired generation, we take 10% of the emissions values calculated in the Southern California Basin. That was the 1990 electricity report. That methodology is not particularly scientific. In fact, it may be ascientific. There is a study group at the Commission. They will not be ready for ER 92, but at ER 94 we will use an entirely different methodology for placing values on emissions. What the percentage will be for out of state, that's up to, that's a committee and or commission call. That's a political call.
We have a question about the long-term energy future of using coal generation in California. I think that question could also be looked at from a national point of view. Long-term future of coal. Anyone?
I'll take one little swipe because I was involved with a particular project. There is the potential, but it would obviously require the use of some of the new clean coal technology. Some of you may be aware that we did a project called Cool Water, coal gasification. And in point of fact, the main purpose of Cool Water was to demonstrate the fact that you could burn coal in California in an environmentally acceptable manner. By environmentally acceptable manner, it was not only meet the standards of the state of California, but also, in essence, in an unwritten statement, was to exceed the emission limitations that you would find on a gas-fired combined cycle unit. And in point of fact, we were successful in doing that. The economics at that time, as expected, were such, especially after the drop in the price of oil and natural gas in the mid-'80s, were such that the project could not self-sustain, if you like, on an economic basis. In terms of the environmental aspects of it, it did demonstrate what it set out to do, and that is have emissions from that particular unit, which were better than you could get out of a comparable naturally gas-fired combined cycle unit.
Now let me add something to that. I personally, and this is a personal view, am a little bit, more than a little bit concerned. I am concerned about what I think happens in the political system given the strength of the environmental movement. We have seen in localities in California where small power producers wish to build a coal-fired plant and cannot do it. If you're under 50 megawatts, you cannot come before the California Energy Commission. So if someone wants to build a 25 megawatt coal-fired power plant, that's subject to local jurisdiction. And we've actually had people come to the commissioners and ask them if they came with a 50 megawatt power plant, what would be the likely outcome of the siting process. Now, what concerns me about this is that coal is black and green is in. And I don't know how politically you make something that's black look green. And we may in California be really shooting ourselves in the foot. We have staff members, for example, who are adamantly opposed to coal because it's dirty. And this doesn't have this is not a function of the technology, it's not a function of the economics, it's just a bad rap that coal has. That's a political problem, and it's becoming